I was inspired to do this for a couple reasons. One, inspired because someone made a comment that was like, I'm new to thrillers, what should I be reading? And I was like, I have thoughts. Two, I think I've been thinking a lot about like lists and like what is our like modern literary canon. The New York Times came out with a list of the top 100 books that have been written this century. And I obviously, like any good reader girly who's also chronically online, I spend a lot of time looking at the list and then reading a lot of think pieces about the list, reading alternative lists, reading things that were wrong with the list, reading the version of the New York Times list that was put together by readers. And I think one thing that everyone can kind of agree was missing from the New York Times list was there was not a lot of genre fiction. And as someone who reads primarily genre fiction, who writes genre fiction, I thought that was a disservice to all the genre fiction books out there. And so I decided to compose a list of my top 10 thrillers of the past decade, which I wanted to limit it to one per author, because otherwise some of these girlies would be on here more than once. And I also wanted this to kind of like serve as like a great starting point if you're someone who's wanting to jump into the world of thrillers but is feeling like really overwhelmed. I think I tried to get like a broad spectrum of thrillers. I think thriller is actually like a quite broad genre, and there can be things that like really lean more mystery. There can be things that lean all the way horror. There are things that can be just like don't have any of those like mystery or horror elements, but are just something super fast-paced, high stakes, dangerous. And so I wanted to pick the books that are books that I have read and really enjoyed, and also I think exemplify one or a couple of those hallmarks of the thriller world, and also like highlight the wide variety of like subgenres within thriller. So if you are new to thrillers, I think this is a great place to start. The first book on this list is the book that I feel the strongest about, to be honest. We're going to start with the top. I know that's like not traditionally where you start, but like we're starting with the best of the best. And the book that I think really revolutionized, at least in my perspective, the thriller genre in terms of like who was reading it and who it was marketed towards. And that is the book Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. This book came out in 2012 and the movie came out like a couple years later. And I think it really reshaped the thriller landscape. I think before then we had like a lot of like spy thrillers, a lot of like police procedurals, and I'm sure we had domestic thrillers. I'm sure they were out there, but this brought domestic thrillers to the forefront of like what everyone was reading, and I think particularly what women were reading. Gone Girl, if you are not familiar with the premise, is the story of this man whose wife goes missing. She's Gone Girl. And she is the Gone Girl. And we're getting the story from his perspective. He finds out his wife is missing, like in the first chapter. And then we were also getting her diary entries in the months leading up to her disappearance. And let me tell you, I recently reread Gone Girl and the writing is superb. I think people know Gone Girl for the twist. And if the twist hasn't been spoiled for you, like I'm not going to spoil it here, but like go read it immediately before someone spoils it for you. But I think even if the twist has been spoiled and you haven't read it yet, the book itself is well worth the read. Like the writing is exquisite. Gillian Flynn is so incredibly talented, and again I think she really revolutionized the domestic thriller, and I think a lot of the domestic thrillers that have come after that have really kind of been modeled after in a lot of ways Gone Girl. I also, because I made for myself that one author rule, did not include her other two thrillers, Dark Places and Sharp Objects, but I love both of them, and to be honest they would both be on my top 10 list. I think she's just like a truly phenomenal writer that writes really interesting, really compelling thrillers that sit like perfectly in the center of my interests of like mysterious versus like high stakes and realistic versus a little kooky. Okay. The next book I read was one of the books that like really shook me as a reader. It is, in general, I think going into thrillers, if you are someone who does look up content warnings, you should do that for every thriller you go into. Thrillers tend to deal with darker subject matter, and so like it's important that you are taking care of yourself and making sure that it is covering material that you feel comfortable reading. But I'm going to highlight that so strongly for this next book because this book is, to this day, probably one of the most like graphic, violent, disturbing books that I've ever read. But I felt like it was incredibly well done, well executed. I enjoyed it. I like could not stop reading. I was at the edge of my seat, and that is Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. The like premise of this book is that we have this young woman whose sister went missing when she was, I think they were both like teens, and no body was ever found, and no one knows what happened to her sister. And more girls have started disappearing in a very similar way to her sister, and so she starts to kind of investigate. The latest girl that has gone missing like really echoes the way her sister went missing, and so she starts to kind of like dig into it and, you know, see how these echoes from her past are playing out in her present day. It is, like I said, one of the darkest books I've ever read, but like the twists were incredibly compelling. It was so gripping. I was like edge of my seat the whole time I was reading it. Truly like fantastic. I still think about it to this day, and I read it at this point like probably like 6 years ago. Like I read it a long time ago, and it's still like a thriller that really stands out in my mind. Next is No Exit by Taylor Adams. Think kind of thrillers existing in this like quadratic axis. On one axis we have like realistic to cuckoo crazy banana train. Okay. And then on the other axis, we have like high stakes to mystery. Like, where are we focused more on like the action of like running away from a present danger? Or are we trying to figure out what that present danger is? And I think, you know, most books exist on the spectrum here and here. Okay. No Exit by Taylor Adams exists much closer to the like high stakes adventure than the mystery. Like, there's definitely some twists, there's reveals, we learn things, but like the reason you're on the edge of your seat is because, not because you're like, oh, what's gonna happen next, is because you're like, oh my gosh, how is our girlie gonna get out of this situation? You know? The premise of this book is it is a young college student. She is driving home. I don't know if we know the reason at the beginning of the novel. She's driving home and she gets stuck in this rest stop. There's a blizzard that blows in. She's in the Colorado mountains. She's driving home from Boulder, and she gets stuck in like, I'm pretty sure the Colorado mountains in a blizzard. And there are a few other people at this rest stop. And pretty quickly she goes outside to like try to make a phone call because she doesn't have great cell reception in the rest stop. And she's trying to find like a spot where she gets cell service out in the parking lot. And she sees a little girl who is locked in a cage in one of the cars. Yeah, a little girl has been kidnapped and is being held hostage at this rest stop. They are completely snowed in at this point, so she can't like drive down to get help. She knows it's someone else in the rest stop. There's not that many of them. I want to say there's like maybe like 5 or 6 of them in the rest stop. She knows it's someone else there because like, and so she doesn't really know what to do. And the next steps are just her trying to figure out how she's going to get this little girl and herself out of the situation safely, because they feel quite trapped, and they are quite trapped. Anyway, I just found this book to be so compelling, so gripping. I like don't know if I've ever had an experience quite as like page turnery. Like, I just like could not, I just like had to sit there and keep reading because I needed to know what was happening next. It is so fantastic. I would recommend this really, really highly. And if you really enjoyed this, looking for books that are like super high stakes page turnery, I actually recently read Night Watching by Tracy Sierra, and I think it has a similar kind of feeling where you're like, how are they going to get out of this situation? Next up is, I think this one might be the most recent entry into this list. And I think it might surprise a lot of people. I know this had like mixed reviews, but I absolutely loved it. And I think it's such a great example of the kooky banana side of thriller. This is where I like things to go here. I like to call them, when I'm like colloquially talking about these, as like Scooby-Doo thrillers. We've got like the bad guy has some sort of like plot, you know, like there's a plot happening. They have an evil scheme of some variety. That's what's going on in a lot of these silly, goofy books, is there's like some grand conspiracy, whether that's like a larger group that is like, you know, there's like a cult that like needs them for a human sacrifice, or like this person has like an evil plot and they're trying to like take over this person's life, or like whatever. There's something like silly, goofy, conspiratorial about these thrillers that I really, really enjoy. Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. The premise of this one is that a young woman gets accepted kind of last minute into this writing program in which she is going to be like on a writing retreat for a month in this house. It's in upstate New York, and she is going to be under, it's like a residency, and she's going to be under the mentorship of her favorite author. All these young women, they're like young women in their 20s. I think our protagonist has turned 30, which is like part of the like drama, and they're going to be up at this writing retreat working on their novels under the mentorship of this favorite author. But the catch is her ex-best friend, who that now they are like not friends at all, also was given this opportunity, and so they will be up there together, and things quickly kind of like unspiral from there. I believe like fairly quickly there's a snowstorm, they get snowed up there, so like they're stuck, and then things start getting like crazy and silly. And I loved it so much. It was like such a delight. I think this book is a really great metric to kind of feel out where your like kooky meter lies. Like, do you really prefer like a realistic thriller? Like, this is realistic motivations and realistic actions and realistic choices that people could make. Evil people, but still people. Or do you like something that's a little silly, goofier, a little bit more, I don't want to say fun, because like people are still getting murdered, you know, in these books a lot of times, but like a little bit more conspiratorial, a little more ridiculous, because I do think this lies, you know, just on the like middle of the ridiculous scale. It's not, I've read some books that are like crazy, kooky bananas over here, but like this lies, you know, quite comfortably in the ridiculous side. My next recommendation is one that is, I don't even know if most people would classify this as a thriller, but I'm classifying it as a thriller, and it's my list, so I get to do what I want. And that is Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. I think this book does a couple things really well, which is why I wanted to put it on this list. I think it does dark academia really well, which is like a huge trope within the thriller genre. So these are books that take place largely at like universities, although sometimes you get YA ones that take place at high schools, and there's like mysterious secrets. The girlies are speaking Latin. They're doing some ancient Greek rituals. They're up to shenanigans. And I really think Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas does this super well. And the other thing that I think it does well, that you will either love or hate, and I'm going to be honest, most of the time, I hate it. But I think Catherine House does it well. This is one of my favorite open endings. Like, you don't have closure over everything that happens. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of like left up in the air. Those are not my favorite type of books, personally. I think there's some, if you love them, awesome. I love that for you. But I just like, I have too many questions. I like want to know. I want to know things. I want to be told. I don't need it perfectly closed. I don't need everything wrapped up with a ribbon, but I want more answers than questions. If you really like the open ending part of this, I think some great examples would be Leave the World Behind by, I can't remember the author, but I'll pop the book up there, or Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. Those are kind of like horror thriller. They're like right on the line, which I think Catherine House is as well. There's like supernatural adjacent elements. I would say this also has some supernatural adjacent elements. We're really questioning what is like real and what is perhaps more supernatural. Anyway, the premise, I don't think I've told you the premise. The premise of Catherine House is it's essentially this like university you get selected from, and the who they select is like weird. They're like, it's not necessarily like you have to be top of your class, but it's also not like bottom of the class. Like, it seems like kind of just like random people will be like chosen. And it is like a pretty selective program. And you get put in this program, and for 3 years, you essentially don't have any contact with the outside world. You are fully immersed in this university experience. You live there. You do not go home for holidays. You do not have your phone. You don't have the internet. Like, you're really isolated in Catherine House. And obviously, the vibes are weird. The vibes are spooky. The vibes are creepy. You kind of got just like a sense of unease and a sense of dread the whole book, because like clearly something is up. We are not in like immediate danger, but you know that like danger could be lurking around any corner. So that's Catherine House. Okay, next up, like, is very arguably a horror novel, okay? Like, this is a horror novel, but I'm putting it on my thriller list. Will I also put it on my horror list? Maybe. I haven't made my horror list yet, so I don't know yet. But I think it is really good, and I think it is a great, like, kind of like bridge entry point, like, if you wanted to dip your toe into horror. And I also think it would just be like a shame not to talk about it, because I think it is so brilliant and brings in a couple genres that I want to touch on. And that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This book, one, is historical. I don't read a ton of historical, so I am not in the know about what like the best historical thrillers are. I'm sure that's a genre that like, you know, has some great books in it. It's just not something I read. But I did want to have something historical. I wanted something with like a supernatural bent. And I also love this book. So I was like happy to talk about it. This book, the premise is, it is this young woman whose cousin has recently got married, as she receives a letter from that cousin, and her cousin is like unwell. I don't remember exactly what's in the letter, but like something is not going quite right. And so this girl decides she's going to go visit her cousin, and she goes up to where her cousin lives, and she is living in this like manor house in a small town, and it is like kind of decrepit. The vibes are weird. They're not good. The vibes are not great. Not great almost immediately. You know, something is kind of going wrong in the house. But the cousin is like, oh no, everything's actually fine. It's so weird that that letter got sent to you. Anyway, it gets spooky, it gets creepy. There's like weird nightmares. There's like really gross, weird stuff. Again, content warnings, but like so edge of your seat, so gripping, such a fun read. And if you then find you do like supernatural mixed into your thrillers, this one almost made the list, but didn't quite make the cut. Oh, it was sad to have it go. But this is another one that like really is like kind of maybe like on the line between horror and thriller, and that is Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This book has vampires. Obviously, you know it by the title. We're following like a group of kids. No, we're not. We're following a group of like mothers who are in a true crime book club in the 1980s. And they believe vampires have come to their town. They're correct. There are vampires. And they've decided to take it into their own hands to get rid of them because the vampires are eating up the kids. And that's not cool. I love this book. I think it's so fun. I think it is such a delight. And I think it really does a great job of blending kind of like those like edge of your seat thriller moments with the supernatural spooks. Another genre blending thriller that I have to recommend. This book had me on the edge of my seat from like literally page 1, which is such a hard thing to do. I'm such a cranky girl when it comes to starting a new book. It's like my biggest book vice is that like I'll start a new book, I'll read like literally 1 page and I'll be like, I'm not captured yet. Which like, yeah, obviously you don't know any of these characters. You have to read more than this. I think it's probably because my brain is broken from the internet, but I persist and I continue on and then I read books and I'm fine and it's okay. But this book had me from page 1, and that is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Page 1 opens with this man being kidnapped by a guy who looks just like him. His literal like doppelganger, his identical twin. He doesn't have an identical twin, but this man who looks exactly like him is kidnapping him. Okay, that's kind of weird. That is super weird, actually. And it really starts to just like domino effect from there. It is crazy. It is so fun. It is a science fiction thriller. There's a very heavy like science fiction element that comes into play with the like doppelganger situation. You find out pretty quickly what's going on. It's so good. It is so good. It is so fantastic. This is the kind of book that I recommend a lot for when people are like, I'm going on a road trip with my boyfriend. What could we read in the car? This is a book that is like appealing to everyone. Like it is just like so gripping, so page turning that I really think that like, I think almost anyone could read and enjoy this book. I've got another recommendation that I'm sneaking in here. If you really are enjoying the science fiction thriller or like think you might like that vibe, I also absolutely loved Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister, another Gillian on the list, which is a time travel thriller. Really good. Definitely leans more like women's fiction, science fiction. like it has definitely more of like a focus on character and relationship in the thriller aspect. It is much less like high stakes, but it has a science fiction element because of the time travel. They actually like have very little in common, except you could technically classify them in the same subgenres. But I loved it and I wanted to slide it in there. It didn't make the list, but I loved it and I wanted to talk about it. And then next up is the like literary thrillers. And my like book that I had to include on the list for like a literary thriller, this one was hard for me because I actually read and loved quite a few literary thrillers. But I decided to go with The Push by Ashley Audrain. The thrills in a literary thriller are gonna be much slower. We are much more interested in focusing on the people and building up the characters and making sure you have like a really clear like depth of understanding of them and their relationships and also the larger societal context in which they live. But I think it's well worth it. The Push is the story of this mother, and she has a daughter, and she is like pretty quickly having a hard time like forming a bond with this daughter and begins to suspect her young daughter is maybe a psychopath. And we learn about not only this mother and her daughter, but also her mother and her mother's mother. We like learn about these generations of women and how their relationships to each other have kind of affected the way that they parent and the way that they live. And that is really fascinating. But we also do have a thriller element. I'm not going to reveal what the like starting point for the like thriller doesn't really happen to like the halfway point, even though it's like on the back cover. So I'm not going to talk about it here, but like, if you read the back cover, I do think it will tell you if you want to know. But I think it is really compelling. It is like a really interesting story about like generational trauma and like mothers and daughters and like the fraught relationships those can form there. And also just like, you know, we love a psychopath kid. That's like a fun little trope. And I think The Push does it absolutely beautifully. If you want another literary thriller, would be Long Bright River by Liz Moore, I believe. No, Liz Moore or God of the Woods. Who wrote Long Bright River? We're gonna look it up real quick. Sorry, God of the Woods just came out and I haven't read it yet, and I'm really excited. Everyone has been talking about it. It's been like one of the, like, I think bigger hyped books over the past couple months, and I haven't read it yet, but I loved Long Bright River by Liz Moore, so I'm excited to read God of the Woods. Anyway, Long Bright River by Liz Moore is also one of my absolute favorites. And it was really a toss-up between putting the two of them there. I put The Push because I felt like it was a bigger book, like more talked about. And so like it's a better book if you're gonna like, if you're just kind of wanting to read the canon of like what everyone else has read, which I think is part of what I was going for with this list. I think that's the move. But I do love Long Bright River by Liz Moore as well, as like a slower thriller. That one, Long Bright River, is also like a procedural, which I think, I don't have any procedurals on here. They're normally not my vibe, but I loved it. Long Bright River. Oh my gosh, so good. Next, we have Mr. Riley Sager. These last couple are like really big names that I wanted to make sure made the list because I really feel like their thrillers every single year are some of the most talked about thrillers that everyone is talking about, because that's what most talked about means. And I think if you're getting into thrillers, these can be a great place to start because you can find an author that you really enjoy. And all of these guys that I'm about to get into have like a backlist of a few books at least that you can jump into from there. Riley Sager, I think, is often, top of the Goodreads Choice Awards. He, especially in the past couple releases he's really started to like add a little bit more variety to these books. The books are different. Like there are some Riley Sagers I really, really love, and there have been a couple that I've liked significantly less. But I have at least started. There's one Riley Sager I DNF'd, but I've at least started every single Riley Sager book that has come out. One, because I liked, as you know, if you've been on this channel for a minute, I like to be reading what the girlies are reading, and the girlies are reading Riley Sager. My recommendation, if you were going to start with Riley Sager, is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This is my favorite Riley Sager. It is probably one of the kookier Riley Sagers, but I think it is so fun. It is so delightful. The premise is it's this young woman living in New York, and she gets this job as an apartment sitter in this like luxury apartment building. It is like gorgeous, top of the line, amazing. Obviously, this job is too good to be true because the building is employing her as like an apartment sitter to essentially like babysit these apartments until they like get an owner. It's just like kind of a weird job. She's getting like paid to live in a beautiful apartment. There's a lot of rules, like she cannot have guests over ever. She like can't like associate with other people in the building. Like the vibes are just kind of like weird. Something nefarious is clearly going on. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a book. Where this book goes is, I would say, definitely more on the cuckoo bananas side of things. But it is so fun. It is so delightful. I loved it so much. Next up, we have None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This is another release that is very recent. This is the last year book release. Lisa Jewell is not someone I've read a ton from. I've read a few of her books, but not a ton of. But None of This Is True was one of my favorite books I read last year. I absolutely loved it. The premise of None of This Is True is it's the story of these two women. They meet in a restaurant bathroom, and it is both of their birthdays. They are birthday twins. They're the exact same age, and their birthdays on the same day. One of them is like a podcaster who does like girl boss style like podcast. She like interviews successful women about like how they became successful. And the other one is like, you should do a podcast series about me, because my life is terrible right now, but I'm about to turn it around. So you should do a podcast series about like how I got here and then how I'm going to turn my life around. And through this, the women they like start this like tenuous relationship. They're like friends-ish because they're spending so much time like chatting, and they're living these lives that are so different. We have the podcaster who's living this like very like, well-off life with like a gorgeous husband and like living in a beautiful house, and like her life seems like very perfect on the exterior. And then we have this woman who's living a life that is like, very much like in shambles in a lot of ways. We just follow their relationship, and we also, over the whole time, I think this is one of the best done titles, because the whole time we have the title hanging over us, the title of None of This Is True. We know that one, if not both of these women are lying in some capacity, and as they spend more time together, these lies start to unfold, and it's just so interesting. It was so unique. I think I took a break from thrillers for a couple years because I was finding that a lot of the thrillers were having like the same plot twists and the same twists and turns, and they were becoming like too predictable, and I was losing my enjoyment. This felt like something I had never read before. It was like twisty, but it was also so focused on these characters and building them to be like these whole interesting, complex people. And I just absolutely loved it. I think Lisa Jewell in general loves to write like a twisty, kind of grittier, woman-centered thriller. She does a lot of like domestic thrillers where we're focused on like the family structure. I think if you really liked the characters of Gillian Flynn, Lisa Jewell might be a good connection point. Very different like story-wise, but I think character-wise, there's like a lot of similarities, and she really loves like kind of like an unlikable, complex protagonist. Next up in my list of like big names is Miss Ruth Ware. Ruth Ware is turning out books, and she has been for like a long time. Like Ruth Ware has been out here putting in the work. And I had not read every Ruth Ware. I'm actually like quite behind in my Ruth Wares. I read her most recent release, and then I've read several of her like older releases, but I kind of like missed a chunk in the middle because she's just like putting out a book every year without fail. Girl is working. But my recommendation for Ruth Ware is this was a hard one for me, but I decided to go with like the popular consensus versus my favorite. Okay. Then Ruth Ware's most popular book, according to Goodreads, is The Woman in Cabin 10, which I did read and enjoy. My personal favorite is In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. They have a similar-ish vibe. I think they like were published like a year apart. I think they were pretty close in her canon. But I'm going to put The Woman in Cabin 10 on this list. The Woman in Cabin 10, the premise of this is it's this journalist. She's like a travel journalist, and she gets assigned to cover this small luxury cruise boat. Like, there's not that many people on it. It's not like a big, giant Royal Caribbean cruise. Like, it's like fairly small. And she's in her room, and she is either out on her balcony or looking at her balcony. I don't remember exactly where she is. But she looks out and she sees the woman next to her get pushed overboard. Like, she goes over the side of the ship. And obviously, being a reasonable person, she like freaks out. She tries to tell people. She tries to let everyone know kind of what happened. And they're like, no one is missing from the boat. Everyone is here and accounted for. And also, no one was in that room. Like, this is a ship for this, like, first run was, like, mostly for, like, press, I think, or something like that, where, like, the ship wasn't, like, completely booked out. And the room next to hers was just, like, an empty room. So, like, no one should have been in there to begin with. But she's like, no, I saw someone. And they're like, we don't know who it could have been. And so, from there, we start to figure out what the heck is happening on this boat. What the heck happened to that woman? Was there a woman? Is she an unreliable narrator? What is going on? And I think it's a fun read. Ruth Ware, I feel like her catalog is maybe one of the most diverse. I know I talked about Riley Sager having kind of a little bit of everything and every book of his being a little different, but I think Ruth Ware does that to like the utmost. She writes, I think, entirely in the thriller genre, but like some of them are like classic domestic thrillers. She has like a gothic novel that I loved. She has, like, the last one I read is more of like a survival story than anything else. Like, we have like the classic And Then There Were None, Agatha Christie type story with like one by one, like quite a broad spectrum. So I think you could probably find a Ruth Ware for you depending on your personal thriller taste. Sorry if everything has changed. Taylor's featuring Ed Sheeran. The battery did die and then I had to charge it. And while I was charging, I went and ate lunch. So it's a new dawn and it's a new day. But it's not a new day. It's actually just like, I don't know, 20 minutes later. Last book on the list is by Lucy Foley. I feel like Lucy Foley is the absolute queen of like atmosphere, of like just an absolutely gorgeous atmosphere when it comes to thrillers. Her books typically take place somewhere super gorgeous, normally like a little bit luxury, and the setting almost becomes a character. I'm actually currently reading her newest release, The Midnight Feast, and it takes place on this like coastal England town at like a luxury resort, and the setting is something that I'm obsessed with. But the Lucy Foley title I'm including on this list is the first book I ever read from Lucy Foley. I think it was kind of like her big book that like broke her out. I think before this she had released a couple books, but I had never heard of her. And that was The Guest List. And I think it was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, which I think is why it got so big. But the setting of this book is perfection. It takes place on this small Scottish island, and there's a big wedding. This wedding is taking place on this private Scottish island. They can only get to it via boat, and I believe a storm blows in and prevents the boat from going back and forth. So they're all trapped on this island, and then someone dies. And we don't know who dies, and we don't know who killed them. And we're going back and forth, and we're like jumping perspectives over time, and we're trying to like figure out both of these things. I think it is like very classic, like a whodunit mystery, but like has that little bit of like a thriller vibe because we are like anticipating this murder happening also in one of the timelines, and we're all trapped on this island. If only my battery could have held out for those last 3 minutes. That is all I have. Those are my top whatever that wound up being, list of thrillers from the past decade or the past of this century. I don't remember, whatever I titled this video. I hope to do this for a few more genres. I think I'm going to do horror next month because it's October, so spooky month. And then I like need to do romance. I feel strongly I need to do romance. I might do fantasy, romantasy. I don't know. We'll see how that one plays out. But I will definitely do a couple genres of these if you enjoy them. If you have any books that you think need to be added to my list of thrillers that you think would make the best thrillers of this century, let me know, obviously, in the comments below. I would love to hear it. I'm always on the hunt for like a new, exciting little thriller. I will talk to you in the next video. Have a good one. Bye.